Namaskar and good morning. I was telling Parth that today must be the real proof of choice, because to get such an audience on a Sunday to come is quite a feat, unless he's figured out some form of coercion behind this choice.
DBT.
DBT. Okay, so you are paying them, huh? So Parth has actually covered a lot of the points I wanted to mention. So let me maybe take a different angle at talking about DBT. First, I think there's a need to remind all of us of how much the whole notion of delivering education has changed over time. I think we all have seen fundamental shifts on the objectives of the delivery mechanism of education. First was certainly the whole issue of access. How do you increase access? And as access increased, there was a real sense, are we providing learning outcomes? So one went from expansion to one of really looking at impact on learning. Embedded in that, there's been a lot of focus on efficiency of delivery. So you start from access, you look at learning, you look at efficiency of delivery. But it didn't stop at that. The new sort of thinking is, but this educational system also has to deliver skills so we can go and get employment, right? So it's another objective that has been put onto education system. And if that is not enough, there's a reminder everywhere that whatever you do, you have to be equitable. For in society, you want everyone to have access to education. So you're including equity in the objectives. And finally, I think we've now begun to look at the linkage between health and education. We're saying we're entering a world where no longer the normal routine learning is enough. We're entering a world where technology is driving us in demanding a very different level of learning capacity. And if that kind of learning capacity is to be developed, we have to start at the early childhood. We have to start at delivering prenatal support, right? If you can't do that, the rest of the education system will certainly not be able to compensate for the damage that is done to children entering the world of education. Now, if you thought that was enough, we also now know that there is a real issue of a legacy that we're inheriting. That legacy of people who have gone through schooling systems that have not really given them the level of skills, the level of learning ability that they need. So the fifth grader can barely pass a second grade school exam. How do you deal with that legacy? Now, my colleagues, if you were to design an education system for India that has to deliver access, that has to deliver learning, that has to deliver quality, that has to deliver efficiency, that has to deal with legacy, that has to deal with remedial education, that's a tall, tall task, right? And I think the first lesson that we take away is one size fits all does not apply in general, and certainly does not apply in the case of education. So we have to look at DBT and ask ourselves, what is the purpose of DBT? Is it to do all of the above? Then you're putting a lot on DBT. Is it just to reduce leakages from government's delivery of services? Perhaps that's probably the most important and doable in the system, right? On the other hand, as Parth has so clearly shown, we are beginning to find superb examples of delivering conditional cash in which we're able to affect poverty, vulnerability, and also influence behavior, health behavior, behavior of choice, getting girls to school. The first program that I looked at was in Madagascar. And Madagascar had two parts to it. One part was conditional grant to get children to school, and the other part was unconditional grant. Both these grants chose women as the center of the delivery. And I think no matter what we do, if we forget that as a big lesson, we will have lost our ability to really make systems work. But what was interesting with the unconditional grant was the nudge, right? So every 2 months, women would come to pick up their cash, and at that center, in addition to handing the cash, the unconditional grant, there would be seminars on health, education, going to school. There would also be what they called learning mothers. So there would be leaders from within that peer group who would also begin to express their views of what has been happening to their children. So unconditional grant with 2 women, with a bit of nudging through peer groups, huge impact, right? Huge impact. Similarly, on the conditional grant, which was directly related to bring your child to the health clinics and so on, also a very big impact. Right? So this was the first sort of DBT that I actually focused on. The second one that I looked at was in my own country, in Bangladesh, and literally reflected what Parth said about the secondary education. This is the girls' secondary education stipend in Bangladesh. Incredible. We basically started off in the early 90s in Bangladesh with girls covering 25% of classrooms in the secondary school. Conditional grants were handed to girls in bank accounts. And in the bank account, basically, there were 3 conditions. So the bank account would be replenished twice a year. And the conditions were simply, first, target toward girls. 2, you had to attend 75% of time in the school. 3, you had to pass the final exams, right? And 4th, parents could not marry their girls before a certain age, right? It was incredible. It was a huge movement towards bringing girls to school. And by 2003-04, we had 53% of classrooms in secondary education with girls, right? So Bangladesh, in fact, achieved the gender equity goal of SDGs quite fast. But what was interesting, and also goes to a point that Parth made, that not only was the money given on the demand side, money was also given on the supply side. In other words, schools were given money if they could go recruit girls. And you know what was the interesting outcome of that story? For the first time, schools did what government of Bangladesh had been trying to do for years and years: build toilets for girls, right? Suddenly, Swachh Bharat was Swachh Bangladesh in an incredible way, because the intervention was through the idea of schools for girls, right? It was a fascinating story. So you can see that used well, both on the supply side and on the demand side, whether you're in Madagascar or you're in Bangladesh, DBT can have a major impact. And it can have a major impact on poverty levels, it can major impact on access, it can have a major impact on nutrition and so on. Whether it has an impact on outcomes of learning and so on, mixed results so far, right? But I would then go back to my original point: don't take one instrument and expect it to deliver everything to you, right? The big lesson here is DBT has to be part of a broader reform program in the school system. It cannot be the reform program. And what have we learned across the years? Just as we've learned that we're demanding more and more of the school system, we've learned that it takes a lot of interventions to make an education system work. We've learned about decentralization. Bring the school closer to the parents and closer to the students. Give more autonomy and decision-making to the schools. SSA, from what I understand, has dramatically shifted in that direction. But programs from Bangladesh to Brazil, that has been very much a big part of the story. El Salvador, coming out of conflict, had started developing community-managed schools, right? Community-managed schools in which you found value for money was huge, but you also found accountability huge because the schools were being overseen by parents. So decentralization is very important. With decentralization, is the governance of schools become very important. Who runs them? Who appoints the teachers? Who oversees the teachers? And again, the relationship between local government, parents, teachers is a very important, important storyline. But we also learned that it's not enough to create an accountability environment. What happens inside the classrooms become extremely important, right? And here the issue of teachers training, capacity building, etc., which hasn't really shown much impact, suddenly begins to show impact when you're beginning to change the accountability and governance of schools, right? But to do accountability and governance and not invest in teachers' capacity, you will lose out. Again, it's a systems story. We've also learned that curriculum needs to be changed, right, in all of this. And often by decentralizing, the curriculum changes that are needed begin to get reflected by the demands at the local level. And here's one area which everyone will say, keep curriculum development national, which I actually agree. This is one thing you can do national, but at the same time, the feedback from below is extremely important to keep the evolution of curriculum going. Then we have learned measurement, right? If you can't measure and you don't measure, you'll never be able to keep the system honest to the clients or to government itself. So just as we have learned over time that the objectives of education have changed, so have the different entry points of reform. And the key linkage to DBT is DBT by itself can't deliver what you want out of an education system. It has to be part and parcel of a broader reform system. A colleague of mine, a professor now at Harvard, and we were hoping would have joined Land Pritchett, said something very important about school choice that I want to read. He said, if school choice is politically given, so if school choice is politically acceptable, then an effective school system can be built around this principle. But if school choice is politically precluded, then an effective school system can be designed around that as well, right? I think it's extremely important not to enter the story of education sector with a dogma, right? One has to enter with an understanding of what political economy will allow you. And the good news, as we have learned, looking at all these facets of decentralizations, teacher capacity, etc., regardless of whether you have politically endorsement for choice or not, you can use DBT in either case and be able to strengthen the school system. And I think that's an extremely important point to do, is decouple DBT from a political choice discussion. Having said that, I think that we who are working on school reform need to put more effort in understanding the politics of why reforms happen. It's very important to ask the question, and I think Parth hinted at it, why would a politician agree to actually do a DBT? Right? And it's a question you have to ask. So, when I came to India about a year ago, I came in the context of some very interesting debate about universal basic income. And there was a lot of debate that if you could take all of these subsidy programs out there, collapse them into a universal basic income and hand that income and create a real floor of income support, that's the most effective way of delivering the subsidy. My first question was, why would a politician who can say, I'm handing you energy subsidy, I'm handing you health subsidy, I'm handing you education subsidy, why would I suddenly give up my right to manipulate the price of a service delivery by saying, gosh, it's a blanket income support to you? Because the moment I do that, I lose the power to actually interfere in service delivery, right? I think we have to understand better under which conditions such reforms happen. And I think those of us who are working on DBT in education have to understand why certain states in India are doing it, what enabled it to be created, and see if there's any reversal that's happening and why reversals are happening. It's a very important area of analysis. But when I look at choice, I think there are two very important elements in the context of India that I'd like to emphasize. I think first and foremost, the most powerful story of choice is, will India truly exercise its federalism? Will India truly allow states to have their ability to innovate, to test out different ideas, and for us to check across states who's doing what, to create a benchmark, right? To bring out the learnings between states and do cross-learning. Well, I think India's political economy in federalism has been changing over time. And it's moving towards the empowerment of the state government. My feeling is that service delivery reform in India will be linked to the strengthening of federalism, right? As federalism emerges even stronger, and one has to thank the finance commissions for just blindly continuing to put more and more cash transfers into the states as a first step, I think kept the story of federalism moving in this country. Today, you have the discussions about cooperative federalism and competitive federalism. And I think that as India moves more towards this, you'll find more innovation. Choice, I believe, will have greater value if indeed states are able to compete against each other in choosing delivery system. It has a deep implication in how government designs its centrally sponsored schemes. If the centrally sponsored schemes are designed in a way that the center determines everything, you will not allow that kind of a choice to happen. On the other hand, if India moves towards the federalism of what we see in Brazil, what we see interestingly in China, which is known as a highly centralized, it's more fiscal transfers against outcomes, allowing implementation choice at the federal level. I think this is a fundamental storyline which will give DBTs an even bigger push. The second point, which I think is very important for us to remember, is DBT is highly demanding of a capacity of a government to implement, right? First, you've got to figure out a way to give universal IDs. India is well ahead of the game in that, right? Second, you have to have a setup which enables you to target people. India is moving towards a social registry which will enable you to say, here we have people of this category not getting this kind of assistance. Third, you have to have very much a financial inclusion system that allows cash to be delivered. And that cash can be delivered in the banking system, and you can use a mobile system technology to do it. Now, as you hear me say this, you're saying, but this is exactly what India is moving towards, right? The JAM story, right? My point is, this is what India is aspiring to move towards. If you look at DBT today, it should be enabled across every single service, but it's actually enabled mostly in 3 services, right? And Rega, the 2 others. PDS and the LPG, right? 3 out of hundreds of schemes, right? How will it increase across? How will it spread? My submission to you is, unless we invest invest in state capability, the capacity of states to function as states, the ability to bring together what are transversal functions, right, are going to be very difficult. And unless you're able to create this transversal function of unique IDs, financial systems, financial transfers, registry, right, is going to be very difficult. And that's linked to basic capacity of governments to actually run governments. And I think the future of India as it goes into federalism is that the growth, economic growth of India will ensure equitable growth if capacity of states also rise equally. And my sense is investing in the capacity of states, basic machinery of the state, is going to be essential if we're going to move into a DBT system and be able to implement it. Today's conversation is a very important conversation for all of you, because I believe that the more we learn from each other about DBT, it will not only influence the story of education, but it must influence the story of education in a broader reform program. Second, it'll inform the discussion about India's federalism. And third, I hope it'll remind us that the future of India must lie in investing in the capacity of states. And I hope that the design and implementation of DBTs will remind us of that. But ultimately, I would look to think tanks, I would look to research organizations, policy groups such as the one that Parth leads, is to do more work on understanding the political economy of why a government would choose to do DBT and why it would not. Thank you very much.